Hey everyone, and welcome. Today I want to talk a little bit about the idea if it is possible for us to predict the future by analyzing the past, and if we reach a conclusion that it may or may not be possible to predict the future, then I would like to try and present my own interpretation and my own predictions of what might happen not only in the future but perhaps even in the very near future. Now, before I begin, I have two things that I want to talk about real quickly before I begin. So, the first thing I want to say is that I'm not a native English speaker. English is not my first language, and I pretty much learned English all by myself. So if I make any mistakes or if my English isn't perfect, then I do apologize. And the second thing that I want to say is that everything that I'm going to talk about in this video, these are my own ideas, my own concepts, my own reflections, and you should never be pressured or have to agree with anything that I'm saying. You should always feel free to disagree and to have your own opinions and to believe whatever you wish. You have your own mind, your own intellect, and you may always feel free to disagree and to believe into whatever you want to. Now, with that out of the way, shall we get started? So, what I'm going to try to do here is that I'm going to try to give a brief explanation of the world in history in the last century, or well, a little bit over a century at this point. And as I said, I'm gonna try and give an overview and not very detailed, so that we can have a little bit of a broad idea. And if you at any moment feel that not only you do not agree, but I am not being very detailed with what I'm presenting, so as I said, if you feel that it may just be an oversimplification and I'm not very detailed into history as a whole, then by all means you can always feel free to express your ideas, your thoughts, on the comments. And if you feel at any moment that more details are needed into what I'm going to present, then by all means feel free to do so in the comments, and I will always be happy to read it. But what I want to say is that when you try to only focus more on the details, and when you really try to get very in-depth into detailed specific points in time and specific events in time, and if you go very in depth, then there's always a chance that you yourself might get lost in those details and not necessarily try to see the bigger picture. You get too focused on only one specific detail, and you might then end up losing trying to get a more overview of what's going on. Not that the details aren't important, of course they always are, but right now I want to try and present a more overview of what's happening, and after that, perhaps in another video and in another opportunity, I might delve more into the details. Okay? So, as I said, I'm gonna try to orient this topic in the last century and going a bit further beyond the last century, so a little bit over a century. So in the 1800s, and especially more or less the middle to the end of the 1800s, so at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, there was, you could say, it was something happened in the world that we had a rise of two very different topics or ideas or concepts that would orient people's view on the world. So it would be two very different world views and two very different topics and concepts about where the world should go, the direction that the world should go, and they were very, very different from one another, very, very different worldviews. And as I said, the direction that the world should go, that the future that the world should go. Now, as the 1800s ended and then the 1900s began, the 20th century, these ideas, these topics, these conflicted views, they started to get more and more intense. You could think of it as a volcano. These ideas, these opposite ideas, these opposite concepts that were very, very different from one another, and the viewpoint that the world should go. These ideas, they start to get more and more heated and more intense, just as the example of the volcano that I just told you. This volcano started to get more and more heated, and then these opposite ideas at one point in the beginning of the 20th century, they began to get so very heated and so very intense that a clash of these two opposite ideas, a clash of these worldviews began to happen. The people defending these two very different core concepts of the world, they began defending it more intensely and more heated, and therefore a clash of these ideas started to happen, a direct confrontation of these two very, very opposite worldviews. And then this volcano, this example of a volcano that I just told you, you could think of it as it getting more and more heated to the point that it started to boil. And then afterwards, this very clash, this very different worldviews that kept clashing, that kept really getting more and more intense. At a certain point, it had a climax, as in the volcano erupted, and that climax, or the eruption of the volcano, is known as, by history, as World War I, right? And this war that happened on the world at the beginning of the 20th century, the 1900s, that war was unlike any before that the world or society or civilization or humanity had ever seen. The world had never seen something like that before, or something of that size, or of those stakes, the stakes that happened in World War I. And so, after the war ended, and during the war especially, there were many who believed that there were so many horrors, there were so many conflicts, there were so many horrible things, unspeakable things that happened in World War I, that many people thought at the time that the world was going to end, that it was going to be the end of the world and society and civilization, and perhaps even the end of the human race as a whole. And of course, the world didn't end. It wasn't the end of the human race, but it was really bad. So after the war ended, World War I ended, people then gathered. There was a sense of unity, of union that happened after the end of World War I. And in this unity, in this union, the people, the society, the civilization, everyone basically, or most of the people all around, they came to the conclusion that they could never allow something like that to happen ever again. That society, that civilization, that humanity, that human beings, that everyone should unite, that everyone should try union in order to prevent such a tragedy from happening ever again. And by doing so, by uniting and by having union, people came to the idea that the concept that the best way to prevent horrors like that from happening ever again, the best way to prevent that would be to try their hardest, to work their hardest to create a world that was perfect, to work towards a utopia. And if you don't know what an utopia is, an utopia is the opposite of a dystopia. A utopia would be a world without wars, a world without hunger, a world without poverty, a perfect world. In Christianity terms, a utopia would be paradise or heaven. And a dystopia is the opposite of that. A dystopia is a chaotic world, a world filled with wars, pain, misery, suffering, poverty all around. And in Christianity terms, you'd basically be hell, or hell on earth, or something really close to that. So you see, at the end of World War I, people then thought that the best way to prevent a dystopia from happening, or the horrors of World War I from happening ever again, the best way to prevent that would be by working towards creating an utopia, a perfect world, so that humanity could create in a perfect world, or in the effort of creating a perfect world, to never allow all those horrors and all of those evil things from happening ever again, and from basically threatening the end of the world, and perhaps even the human race itself. Because as I said, the stakes were very high in World War I, in a way that people never saw before. And therefore people thought that the world might end. And then after World War I ended, there were a period of peace, as I said, a period of union and unity, and this sense of trying to create something that is good for everyone and to create a perfect world. But that peace, that time of peace and union and unity, that peace right there didn't last a whole lot. It didn't last long, because after just a short amount of time, after just a short amount of period in time in history, then those two very different concepts, those two very different ideas, those very two different worldviews, those opposite ways of seeing the world and the direction that the world should go, those different worldviews suddenly, after a short while, after a short period of time in history, those two different worldviews suddenly started to appear again, and then they only got more and more intense. So that volcano that I mentioned before suddenly appeared again, and it started to get more and more heated once again. But The difference is that this time, these concepts, these ideas, these opposite viewpoints and worldviews, and the direction that the world should go, these opposite ways of seeing the world, they were now more modern. They had evolved, they have grew, and they became a little bit more evolved in a world that at that point had also advanced, had also evolved. But the core concept, as in that volcano right there, was still very, very much the same. So you could think of a volcano, or the same volcano, also going through an evolution, but still being the very same volcano in the end, just more evolved. So you see, at that moment, things started to get heated again. Again, those very same opposite ideas, opposite viewpoints, opposite worldviews, and the direction that the world should go. Those two opposite ideas and concepts, they began to get more and more intense and more heated, to the point that they began clashing with one another, or with each other once again. The very same concepts, the very same ideas, the very same different worldviews and opposite worldviews, they began clashing once more. And as things got more intense, the volcano started to get heated once again, to the point that it started to boil, and those worldviews would once again get more and more intense, and more heavy on their clashes and on the opposite ideas and concepts that, and the worldviews that people wanted the world to have. And as the volcano got more heated, and as the volcano got to the point that it was boiling once more, then eventually a climax happened once again. The volcano erupted once more, and it is known, or it is referred in history as World War II. So if World War I was already bad enough, if World War I, people and humanity thought that things had a chance that very likely might end the world, then now in World War II, when the events of World War II happened, then it was even worse. The world had evolved, science had evolved, weapons had evolved, weapons of mass destruction had also evolved. So the stakes became even higher, and the horrors also got even worse, to the point that people thought at the time that if World War I had been bad enough, then now World War II would very likely be the end, because humanity and human race, as many thought, had come real close to end in World War One. But then with World War II, it was even worse, and people thought there's no way that humanity, there's no way that the world, there's no way that the human race will be able to go on. This might very likely be the end. And even with the weapons of mass destruction, especially with the atomic bomb, when the scientists were developing it, they all had a core concept or an idea or theory that there was a chance of a chain reaction. There was a chance that by creating this bomb, this atomic bomb, that it might cause a chain reaction and envelop the whole world, and then the whole world might explode. Back then, the scientists came to a conclusion that that chance wasn't 0%, that there was a percentage that it might happen. So people really thought that people had in their minds that World War II, with all of their horrors, unspeakable horrors that happened in World War II, that it might very likely be the end of the human race right there and then, because it was even worse than World War I. Now, of course, the world didn't end, and the human race didn't end at World War I. Oh, sorry, at World War II. But then, after the World War II had come to an end, after everything ended there in World War II, then the very same thing that happened at the end of World War I started to happen again at the end of World War II. People started to unite once again, and people started to create a sense of unity and union. And then once again, people thought that the only way to prevent such horrors to happen ever again, and to prevent perhaps the world and even the human race to end, would be to create that perfect world, to create that utopia, to make sure that the world would be perfect, that everything would be perfect. Because by becoming a utopia, the people and society and civilization and all of those that were trying their best to seek union and unity, all of them came to the conclusion that by working towards an utopia, by working towards making a perfect world, that right there would be the best chance that humanity had to make sure that the opposite didn't happen, to make sure that those horrors didn't happen once more, and to make sure that the world and perhaps even the human race wouldn't come to an end. So, this, as I said, the very same sentiment that happened at the end of World War I once again appeared in World War II. But now you could think that this sentiment was even stronger. People united even more because the horrors of World War II were so severe that people agreed that there was no other way. They had to unite and they had to work towards creating a perfect world. Now, once again, after the events of World War II ended, once again we had a period of peace, a period where everything and everyone seemed to want nothing but peace and to work together towards that perfect world. Once again, people united, and once again, people had peace. But just as before, that peace right there didn't last long. Once again, that peace was only for a very, very brief amount of time. And once again, those very same opposite ideas, those very same opposite worldviews, those core concepts and core ideas that could never walk together, that could never see the world going in the same direction. Once again, these two very, very different concepts, once again, they began to get more intense and more heated, and those clashes of these different topics, these different concepts, these different worldviews, once again they began to clash at one another. So once again we have the image of that same volcano heating up once more. Now, just as before, this volcano went towards another evolution. Once again, the volcano had evolved. It was a more modern world. The world had evolved, the world had advanced, and this volcano advanced as well. But it was still the very same volcano, a more advanced one, but still the very, very same. And then of course, as the volcano got more heated, and as the volcano started to boil once again, then once more there was the danger of the volcano erupting, of the climax happening once more. Once again, there was the fear that another world war was going to happen. Now, at that moment, right there in time, the worst, this climax, this eruption of this volcano didn't happen. Humanity and society had already gone to World War I and World War II, and they remembered all of the horrors, and they remembered all that happened, and they knew that the stakes had once again got even higher, that science had advanced once more, and that the weapons of mass destruction especially had also evolved. And then humanity and civilization and society all came to the conclusion that if the world and if the human race had almost ceased to be in World War I and then in World War II, then World War III would probably be the end, because there's only so many times that society, the civilization, and the human race, there's only so many times that the world itself and the people that live in this world can get lucky, right? At some point, if things got even more heated and even more advanced, and with the stakes even higher, at some point humanity and society and civilization and the world truly might come to an end. And people understood that. Back then, people understood that. And this period of time is known in history as the Cold War, right? But at the time, people really thought that it was going to be World War III, that World War III was going to happen, and that time around, that it would be the end for humanity and civilization and the human race and the world itself. But people were able to prevent that. People were able to prevent that worst possible scenario from happening, because it was a constant, right? It was a constant. World War I, then right after World War II, and then almost at World War III, and people tried all that they could to prevent that from happening. And they were successful. They prevented the worst possible outcome from happening. And the Cold War ended. This time around, the volcano didn't get to erupt. This time around, the volcano didn't go to its climax. It didn't erupt. However, you see, that volcano right there, it never went anywhere. It was still very much there. Humanity and civilization were able to prevent that volcano from erupting a third time. But that doesn't mean that humanity and civilization got rid of that volcano. That doesn't mean that the world and the human race eliminated the volcano, that they were able to destroy or to make that volcano cease to exist. That volcano is still very much there. All the humanity and all of the civilization and all of the world and the human race were able to accomplish was to prevent it from erupting a third time or once more. But that volcano was still very much there. And you see, after the Cold War ended, after the events of the Cold War ceased to be, afterwards, the very same thing that happened at the end of World War I and World War II once again started to happen. People united. There was a sense of union. There was a sense that the only possible way for a human being to prevent its own downfall and its own destruction would be to go towards making a perfect world, to go towards creating a utopia, because that was the only possible way to prevent humanity from ending itself. But as I said, humanity and the human race were only able to prevent that volcano from erupting a third time, but that volcano is still very much there. And then once again, after the Cold War ended, once again we got a period of peace, a time where everything was good, or perhaps if things weren't perfect, but at the very least people wanted peace above all else, and people wanted to work towards creating a perfect world, towards creating a utopia. So even if things weren't perfect, people still united. There was union, there was unity all around. and people wanted peace above all else, and people wanted to work all that they could, right? That work their hardest towards a perfect world, towards a utopia, because that was the only possible solution, as the human race came to this conclusion that this was the only possible solution to prevent its own downfall. So once again, we had a period of peace and quiet, and where everything was good for the most part, and if things weren't perfect, at the very least there was a sense of unity and union, and wanting to create that perfect world, and wanting peace above all else. But just as I said, that volcano was still very much there. So it didn't take much time, just as all the other previous times, for this very same concept, this very same opposite viewpoints or opposite worldviews of the direction that the world should go, of the direction that the world should have, and these two opposite viewpoints that can never ever walk towards the same path. They can only walk towards different paths, and they can never coexist. Once again, these very different worldviews, once again, they began to get intense and heated, and they began to clash with one another, or with each other once more. Now, the difference is that the world had evolved once again, and so did these ideas, so did these core concepts. They also evolved, just as the volcano evolved once more. But it was still very, very much the same volcano, only more advanced, only more evolved. And now these opposite viewpoints, these opposite ways of seeing the world, now once again they began to get more and more intense, and they began to clash with one another once more. So there is a concept in academy and in academic studies. There is a concept that people and humanity and the human race, or the human beings, that many of them, that they like, that they enjoy, or that they seek to see or to perceive a pattern where there is none. They seek to perceive a pattern where it doesn't exist. People like to see patterns where there is none. But to me, this concept of trying to see patterns where they don't exist, this concept doesn't apply here, doesn't apply in this example. Why? Because it keeps happening all the time for the past century, or even a bit further than a century. They keep happening, and they keep coming back, and they keep clashing with each other or one another, and they never go anywhere, and they are still very much present today. The only difference is that they evolve. This concept, these ideas, these worldviews, they evolve, they advance, they go further as the world and society and the human race go further as well. So to me, it would be a different thing if this concept perhaps once existed in a long distant past and then it reappeared once again after a few centuries, and then they disappeared once again, but then after more centuries passed they return. So maybe if you made that analysis in a longer period of time in history, then maybe you could come to the conclusion, just as I said, that the human beings many times they try to see patterns where there is none. But as I said, I don't think that's the case here, because we're talking about a little bit over a century, and we were talking about different worldviews that have been created or that started to conflict with one another more or less in that time period, a little bit over a century ago. And these core concepts, these different worldviews, they never went anywhere. They are still very much present even today. As I said, the only difference is that they evolved. They became more modern to more modern times, but they never went anywhere. So to me, I can't accept to me it is impossible for me, or I keep denying the concept in academics or in academy, where people like to see patterns where there is none, because to me this concept doesn't apply here. The concept of trying to perceive patterns where there is none, to me this concept does not apply here. Because as I said, these different worldviews, these different and opposite ways of seeing the world and the direction that the world should go, they are very much present still today, and they have been present for almost more than a century now. So to me, these concepts, and just as I said, this volcano is real. It's not a pattern that may or may not exist. To me, it is real. This volcano is very, very much real, and for the most part it has perhaps existed or have been created by a bit more than a century now. And you see, the more I study about this topic, the more I try to go deep in this topic, and as I said, if you try to look very into the details and only the details, then you might get lost in those details. And by focusing so much on those details, especially in history and specific points in time in history, in this a little bit over a century now, if you only focus on the details, then you might get lost in those details, and you might not be able to perceive the bigger picture or this volcano. So to me, this volcano, as I said, is very, very real. And the more I study it, the more I come to the conclusion that it may very well be by design. Even back there, more than a century now, it may have been by design. And you could think that maybe that's not the case, maybe that's that's impossible, that it can't be possible, right? But for me, the more I study it, the more I try to understand it, and to me, more and more I come to the realization that this volcano not only is real, but it was created by design. Even back then, even before the 1900s and the 20th century, even back then, people might have thought of it, have come to this idea, to this concept, to the creation of this volcano, and perhaps they created it as a way to divide, and not as a way to divide and conquer, but as a way to divide and destroy and eliminate, as in literally divide the whole world into one side and the other, and make them clash at one another, so that it can cause its own downfall, its own mutual destruction. Because if you divide the entire world in half, in one side and the other, and you make them clash or fight each other and one another, and there we go, that's it, that's the end. Because if half of the world and human race wants to eliminate the other half of the world and the human race, then there's a very, very, very high chance, at least the way I see it, that they might just go down altogether. That perhaps there won't be any victors, and that perhaps it will all just come crashing down, crumbling down, and it will be the end. And then you have to wonder who or what would want the end of the world? Who or what would want the end of civilization and society and humanity and perhaps even the human race as we know of it? Who would want that? Who would want not the creation of an utopia, but the opposite, the creation of a dystopia, the creation of something that in the worst case scenarios would be hell on earth, or perhaps even the end right there and then? Who or what would want that, right? And I of course intend to talk more about this, and I of course intend to try and reach a conclusion to that question of who or what, most specifically what would want that outcome. But that's something or topic for another video. I do not intend to answer this time around, or this question this time around, because it is not the topic of the video, right? But I do intend to try and study and analyze it, and perhaps come to a conclusion of who, or more especially what, would want that outcome. But then here comes once again the topic of this video and the question at hand. Is it possible to predict the future by analyzing the past? And to me, with everything that I have presented to you now, I think yes, it is possible to predict the future by analyzing the past, and especially by analyzing this volcano that I just talked about in the whole video, right? And then you ask me, well, if we, or perhaps me, have reached the conclusion that this volcano is real and that it is possible to predict the future by analyzing the past, then what would be ahead of us? What would happen right after? And what might even happen to us in the very, very near future? And as I said, and I said this in the video and say it again, I believe the state of the world as it is today, I believe these different viewpoints, these very, very opposite ways of seeing the world, these opposite viewpoints and worldviews that can never seem to go in the same direction towards an utopia, I believe they are once again getting more and more intense and more heated, and they are once again clashing very fiercely with one another. They are once again clashing. And as I said in this example of the volcano, this volcano is once again getting more and more heated, and it is starting to boil, to the point that it is starting to boil. Now comes the question, right? Will this volcano erupt once again? Will a climax happen once again? And are we very, very near from this climax to happen? Now, of course, I want to give you an answer to this question, and I very much intend to give an answer to it. But I feel that this is something that I should make an entire video about, and this is something that I intend to do in the next video. The next video I would try and give an answer to that, right? And more specifically to this volcano, if it will erupt or not, what are the chances of it erupting today, and what might happen to all of us, to the world, to humanity, civilization, and the human race as a whole, if this volcano was truly, or is truly, going to erupt once more. But as I said, I intend to make that answer in the next video. But that is for this video. That's all that I'm going to try to say and to analyze. So this is where I'm going to end the video. But if you liked it, if you liked what I had to say, if you liked my analysis, if you liked everything that I said, then I thank you. Really, truly, I thank you. And if you disliked it, if you thought that perhaps, just as I said in the beginning of the video, I didn't present enough details, and you'd like to present those details and perhaps even come to a very different conclusion than what I said, then please, by all means, do so. Present to me those details in the comments, and I'll be happy to read them all. I'll be happy to analyze them all. If you feel that you should share with me your thoughts and those details with me, then I'll be very, very happy to read them. But for now, this is where I'm going to end the video. So I thank you. I thank you once again. I thank you for listening to me. And hopefully we'll soon see each other again very, very soon. Thank you again. Goodbye.